You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. On February 6, 2023, a 7.8 magnitude earthquake ripped through southeastern Turkey and northwest Syria, killing nearly 60,000 people and displacing millions. 3 days after the earthquake, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan visited the devastated site. Erdoğan walked through the ruined streets of Kahramanmaraş, the city at the epicenter of the quake. He's approached by an older woman in a headscarf who embraces him and begins sobbing, and it's not clear whether she's relieved or angry to see him. Erdoğan admitted in a speech that day the earthquake recovery effort was slow and inadequate, and corruption and poor regulation made the city's buildings much more vulnerable. Pundits speculated the disaster, plus the country's ongoing economic crisis, could force voters to rethink Erdoğan later at the ballot box in May's national elections. But Erdoğan defied predictions and triumphed, and not just in his usual strongholds. In hard-hit Kahramanmaraş, Erdoğan won more than 72% of the vote, extending his party's rule for a third decade. To understand the outcome and Erdoğan's vision for Turkey's future, we move to Merve Tahiroğlu, the Turkey Program Director at the Project on Middle East Democracy. Merve, welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Hi, Ray. Thanks for having me.
Was the election, by a comfortable margin, a surprise?
I would say it was a surprise. As you mentioned, there was a large expectation, widespread expectation that the opposition could finally, in this election, unseat Recep Tayyip Erdoğan from power. He has been ruling the country for 20 years, but given the economic crisis and how devastating it's been, and on top of that, this deadly earthquake that we saw in Turkey in February and the government's really meager response to it, none of the state agencies were on the ground helping the earthquake zone in the critical first few hours of the earthquake. And all of this was widely discussed in Turkey. Given this economic crisis and the fallout from the earthquake, people really felt like this time it was Erdoğan's time to go. The opinion polls, of which there are many in Turkey, were showing, I think 12 out of 14 of them were showing in the week leading up to the election, that the opposition leader had a comfortable lead compared to Erdoğan. So we were all surprised that in this election, Erdoğan won yet again.
The elections were judged by observers to be free, if not necessarily fair. How did Erdoğan manage to hold on to power in the face of the problems that you named, the problems that every Turk widely recognizes? Are there tools of state that he controls that gave him an advantage?
I mean, this is a really important question. For the last few years, and there have been many elections in Turkey in the last, let's say, 7 years, I mean, each and every one of them, international observers have called these elections largely free but very unfair. The distinction we analysts make between free and fair is usually that, okay, if an election is unfair, it means that the playing field is heavily tilted towards one of the parties engaging in the election. But we call it free if there are not massive evidence of attempts at rigging the ballots. So the people, when they vote, each and every one of those ballots are counted. And so your vote actually counts and there remains elections. So we call that free, but we say it's unfair given the government's control. And now I think there's a big reckoning among all political scientists looking at Turkey, asking, can we really call this a free election when there is no freedom of expression, when the government, as in Turkey, controls more than 90% of the media, and the opposition barely is able to get any of its messages out there? So what we saw in Turkey is that many opposition leaders, politicians, have been jailed in recent years. Those who have been running in this campaign and the people around them running their campaign for them have all been facing various bogus, really baseless judicial cases. The mayors of Ankara and Istanbul, who are among the opposition's ranks, are each facing their own judicial problems. The mayor of Istanbul has been convicted of insulting the state recently, just last December, and I think it's a matter of time. Anytime he's going to go to jail. Turkey's second largest opposition party, the HDP, is facing a case in the Constitutional Court of Turkey to be shut down for having alleged links to terrorism. On top of that, the opposition, I mean, it ran a really good campaign, but it ran its campaign entirely on social media. There's only a handful of media outlets in Turkey remaining that even allowed the opposition's rallies to be aired on their network, even mentioned the opposition leaders and what they were doing. But most of the media didn't even mention the opposition leaders by name in the 2 months leading up to this election. So if you're an average Turkish citizen, you really had no idea what the opposition was up to or that it even existed. All you got was Erdoğan, 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 and what he's up to. So given this very heavily tilted playing field, I'm not sure that we can really call this election free, even though we didn't really see a mass attempt at rigging the vote, stealing the ballot stuffing, things like that.
As it happens, I've interviewed President Erdoğan twice and found him a compelling figure. And I've been lucky enough to be in Turkey twice, and let me tell you when, so you'll understand my question. The first time was right after a military coup in the early 1980s. So I got to see that Turkey. The next time was at the end of the 2000s, really almost 30 years later, and it was astonishing to see the change in the country. A richer, more comfortable, more affluent, better infrastructure country. And while I would never be so simple-minded as to say one thing is the direct result of the other, do people associate, do voters associate the new, richer Turkey with Erdogan's time in office, even with the current economic crisis in place?
That is absolutely right. I mean, especially for Erdogan's voters, they associate prosperity and development and economic growth entirely with Erdogan. And we have to give him credit. I mean, in the first 10 years that he was in power, between 2003 and 2013, Turkey's GDP tripled. I mean, the main reason for that, we have to be clear, was Erdogan was promising to be a democratic leader, someone who can marry conservative Islam with democratic governance. And this was extremely appealing to the West. Turkey was on the path to joining the European Union, or at least the process was ongoing. Erdogan and his party were implementing a lot of reforms domestically that they needed, democratic reforms, in order to attain EU membership. And all of this was extremely attractive, particularly to Europeans, and Europe is Turkey's largest trading partner at the end of the day. And we had, in this first 10 years of Erdogan, given this picture, massive amounts of investment, European investment in Turkey, both in the Turkish stock market, but also in terms of Europeans coming in and creating companies and investing in Turkish companies. That created a large economic boom. I have to say, though, this economic boom was not equally distributed in Turkey. So one thing Erdogan wanted to do, I mentioned previously that his supporters, the religious conservatives, have always felt before the 2000s that they were, and you mentioned the military coup of the 1980. So this was the height of the ancien regime, the previous regime that I'm describing. In this regime, there was a secular elite, and economically, the secular class, the secular half of Turkey, was much more powerful than the religious conservatives. Women wearing headscarf were not even allowed in universities, let alone in getting jobs, in jobs in government, etc. So one of the things Erdogan wanted to do, and how he used this economic growth, this coming foreign investment flood, he wanted to create a new religiously conservative middle class. So the middle class in Turkey boomed under Erdogan's first 10 years. But a lot of that was the previously lower class, poorer people who lived in the villages or the slums of Istanbul, right, in the banlieues. And these people, he really developed them economically. He cultivated a new economic class. A large part of that came at the expense of the previously more wealthy, affluent, secular upper middle class. There was a certain economic displacement there too. So on the one hand, half of the country saw Erdogan as giving them an unprecedented opportunity for economic growth. And he did this through channeling government resources into these new companies, public tenders going into people who previously would never have such opportunity, and in part taking that opportunity away from the established former secular economic elite. There was a bit of a displacement there, but ultimately a massive new middle class that grew under Erdogan, people who didn't have access to education, didn't have access to public health care, who now do, associate all of those gains with Erdogan. So even in the face of the economic crisis, they feel that if anybody is going to get us out of this economic crisis, it's Erdogan. And they fear that if the opposition takes control, it will turn us back to our previous status. It will take everything from us. It will call the way our economic growth happened. It will call it corruption. And especially the cronies that emerged under Erdogan even fear getting prosecuted under an opposition-led government for corruption, for taking bribes, right? So they are worried that if the opposition wins, the previous Turkey will come back and they will go back into being an underclass. This is why I think Erdogan supporters persist on supporting him, despite Erdogan's very personal and clear role in bringing about this economic crisis.
The shift you describe is not a small thing in historic terms. For all of a generation in charge, Erdogan has not just been pushing back in a short-term sense against the secular elite, but pushing back against all of Turkey's modern history. Go back to Kemal Atatürk and the Young Turks, who took the core of a collapsing Ottoman Empire and created a modern republic out of it, switched the script from Arabic to Latin script, and took one of the defining roles of the Sultan, being a caliph, the head of Muslims, and took that out of the equation entirely. Kemal Atatürk was not interested in being a religious leader, made it very clear he wasn't. And that has been the guiding principle for much of Turkey's modern history. And the country was praised outside its borders for trying to thread that needle, become a modernizing place, become a wealthier place, still be religious, but have secular government. And Erdogan really overturned that table. He said, look, we're not doing that. He even turned the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque for people who have been tourists and visited Istanbul. This church turned mosque turned museum, it's now a mosque again, and in a very potent symbolic gesture. Is that process done? Has a new equilibrium been reached in Turkey?
Well, this is, you described it perfectly, what Erdogan wants to do. There's a saying, his government used to use this word 10 years ago, where they look at the modern Republic of Turkey. So now this year is the centennial of that republic. In October, it will mark the 100th year of the modern republic, the secular republic. And Erdogan and his government, the people close to him, see this modern republic as the 100 years as a parenthesis in Turkish history. So 10 years ago, they would call it, this is the 90-year parenthesis in Turkish history. They start Turkish history from the Ottoman Empire, as you said. They think of it as, now in the last 800 years, the last 100 years of Turkey, this modern republic, has been an exception. And we want to take it back to what it was previously, back to its roots. They think of the Ottoman times as reflecting Turkey's fundamental identity that has been stripped away from the Turkish people by the modern republic. And as Erdoğan looks forward, he ran his campaign talking about the centennial and the new Turkish century moving forward. He's thinking of himself as a hero who will save that Turkey, who will usher in a second republic, let's call it, a new republic, which will be defined more closely especially in terms of identity with the Ottoman Empire, meaning much more religious, governed in its own way in terms of foreign policy as a regional leader that the rest of the Middle East and the Balkans can look up to in the same way that the Ottoman Empire projected so much power over its region. Turkey will once again become a power like that. If I say it more in brief terms, he wants to make Turkey great again, quote unquote. And this is what his voters are very much vying for. I think neither vision of what Turkey is correct, of course. Turkey's politicians need to forge what Turkey will be, and its citizens need to forge what Turkey will be moving forward. But this is very much how Erdoğan sees his role. So he has a very long-term vision that he wants to achieve. And the reason why he wants to control so much of Turkey's media, the way he uses the education system, and Turkey has a very centralized education system. Everybody reads the same textbooks, it gets the same curriculum in Turkish schools. He wants to use this to cultivate a new generation of citizens that identify themselves as primarily Muslim and dominant in the region, and not necessarily with democracy or being part of the Western-led liberal world order, the way the modern Turkey's founding fathers intended. So it's a big project that he's embarking on. And I think what's interesting here is that the fact that Erdoğan has been in power and his regime has been in power for 20 years and has had so much control over Turkey's institutions like the education ministry and controlling so much of the media, I'm actually surprised that he doesn't have more support for this project, that his popularity, his vision seems to be capped at around 52% appeal among the electorate and not more. To me, that's very interesting that there is still a 50% of Turkey that has bought in that what they call a parenthesis, that new project of a secular, Western-oriented Turkey and liberal Turkey. They have taken that so much to heart that even with all of Erdoğan's control for the last 20 years over most things happening in Turkey, there is still a 50% that resists that vision and still is rooting for that other vision. To me, that's a fascinating phenomenon.
Well, one way or another, he's in office, if his health holds, for at least another 5 years. Let's talk about what that means to the rest of the world. Foreign ministries around the world have watched Turkey navigate this new landscape created by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Turkey controls the sea lanes into the Black Sea. Turkey no longer has a land border with the Soviet Union, but it still is a neighbor to Russia. The early days of the war featured daily devastating punchback from Ukraine using Turkish-made Bayraktar drones. At the same time, Erdoğan kept the lines open to Putin and Moscow, even as Russian men fleeing conscription poured into Turkey. So it's a very mixed, interesting picture. How has Erdoğan played what, in a lot of ways, is not a very good hand?
Yeah, it's not a good hand, even though he projects it as that. Look, I mean, Erdoğan's goal, as we mentioned, is to make Turkey independent. What does independent mean on the global stage? It means not dependent on NATO for security, not dependent on the West in terms of where it sees itself. Turkey should not necessarily be a country that is, dying to join the European Union and then it will be prosperous. Turkey is not necessarily a country in Erdoğan's vision that is part of the Western-led order. It should be independent. It should do its own thing. It should work with the West sometimes, work with Russia sometimes, work with China sometimes. Erdoğan wants Turkey to be one of the poles. We talk about the world being unipolar, led by a dominant United States, or multipolar. There is US, there is Russia, there is China, and these are nodes that other countries sort of come around. Erdoğan wants Turkey to be one of those nodes. He has always said at the UN, the world is bigger than five. He refers to, in terms of five, the permanent members of the UN Security Council, which was decided after World War II, when US, Russia, Germany, and France, when these were the world powers, leading world powers. When he says the world is bigger than five, what he really means, he doesn't mean it's 20. He means to say it's six, and Turkey should be that sixth power that everybody looks to. And Turkey as the regional leader, region meaning Middle East and some of Eastern Europe, I would call it. So this is what he wants to do. So he has been playing NATO and Russia against one another in order to maximize his own interests, right? Maximize Turkey's ability to maneuver in terms of foreign policy. And he has done that somewhat successfully. He has neither lost his membership in NATO nor gotten into trouble in terms of his relationship with Russia, even though he's supporting the Ukraine, giving Ukraine all these drones to use against Russia. He has maintained working ties with both sides. But it's important to note that playing such a game with Russia for a country like Turkey is a very dangerous and difficult one, because Turkey is actually very dependent on Russia. This is something that isn't mentioned enough, I think, in Western media. Turkey is very dependent for energy to imports, especially natural gas. Russia is its largest, most important supplier of natural gas. And as Turkey tries to diversify away from natural gas, it has built a nuclear power plant, for example, for doing it. But this nuclear power plant is also built by a Russian state company. And so it's actually, in the last 20 years, in trying to make Turkey less dependent on the West, Erdoğan has made it even more dependent on Russia. And that is very dangerous. Turkey and Russia have disagreements over multiple global conflicts in the Caucasus, in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. They are on different sides. When it comes to the Syrian conflict, they're on different sides. When it comes to the Ukraine and Russia conflict, they're on different sides. But I think from Russian President Putin's point of view, it doesn't really matter. Turkey is really useful to Russia because it is acting as, in I think Russia's point of view, like a Trojan horse in NATO, a country that causes problems for NATO's own policies, and it looks like it's working on behalf of Russia within NATO. That is very useful to Russia. And the disagreements that they have with Turkey doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, Turkey is so dependent on Russia. If Russia decides not to send any more gas to Turkey, Turkey is really screwed in that position. So really, Russia has the trump card, and I think it's very dangerous. While Erdoğan wants to make Turkey an independent power, I'm very worried that he's making Turkey much, much more dependent on Russia than it was and should be.
Just over Turkey's southern border is ultra-violent, unstable Syria and the deadly Syrian civil war that's been dragging on. It's trying to steer a course forward in between the rivalries and national interests of other powers. The Iraq War spilled over into eastern Syria. The Russian-American rivalry was displayed in the Syrian civil war. Iran's interests are very important there. So it's a really complicated little place, Syria. Turkey's own desires to control the Kurds inside and outside Turkey's borders are implicated here as well. As Erdoğan embarks on another 5 years, with already a lot on his plate, with a crashing lira and real economic unhappiness in the country, is Syria bound to be a continuing challenge to Ankara?
Yes, but perhaps less so moving forward. You mentioned what I'm going to call a proxy war happening in Syria. It was very much since the beginning of the protests in 2011, and then once it descended into chaos and a civil war in 2012, until the rise of ISIS, and then even after that, really since 2017-18, Syria very much looked like a proxy war. Russia was there for its own interests, as you said, Iran, the United States. Turkey joined in 2015-16 when the US partnered with the Kurds, and it looked like the Kurds were about to declare autonomy and create potentially a statelet there in Turkey's border, which is a no-no in terms of Turkey's, what it calls its national security interest, because Turkey has a very large Kurdish population. They make up about 20% of Turkey's population, and a lot of these Kurds aspire to have autonomy within Turkey and perhaps independence themselves. So Turkey always looks at what happens with the Kurds outside its borders as what does that communicate to the Kurds within Turkey? Are they going to try to use this opportunity to break away from Turkey? And this idea that the Kurds are fighting a terrorism battle against Turkey. So from Turkey's point of view, the Kurds are one of the top security issues as they see it. So Turkey joined Syria as well. It also opened its borders to millions of Syrian refugees, which right now in this last election cycle became the top issue, right? The number one issue going into this election in Turkey was the economy. The second issue was migrants. The fact that Turkey is home to, I think, more than 4 million Syrians, and as well as some Afghan and Pakistani migrants, refugees. This was a huge part of the social schism. People identified the issue of presence of refugees in Turkey as the second most important thing for them after the economic crisis going into this election. So all sides of the political equation in Turkey are trying to find a solution, quote unquote solution, to hosting so many refugees, something Turkey is very unfamiliar with. And Turkey is a relatively homogeneous country in terms of ethnic diversity. There are Turks, there's about 20% Kurds, but now there are also Syrian Arabs, and that's a very new thing that people have to grapple with. The opposition going into this election was very much campaigning on the idea that they want to send the refugees back. And even though Erdoğan himself has never really said it, he understands that there is a large section of the population that wants Syrian refugees, at least some part of them, a faction of them, to be returned to Syria. Is that ever possible? Is that a possibility? Absolutely not. There's no way these Syrians are going to return voluntarily in accordance with international law to Syria. But right now, what's interesting is that we're seeing a potential rapprochement between Turkey and the Assad regime in Syria, the very regime that the Turkish government tried with the United States to bring down just 10 years ago by supporting a lot of opposition fighters against the Assad regime. I think Erdoğan is interested in pursuing this rapprochement with Assad. There have been a few meetings already between the two sides. Erdoğan and Assad have not yet met. I don't know when they will meet, but I think this is very much in the cards, in the works. It's very possible that within the next 5 years, we're going to see Turkey re-recognize the Assad regime in Syria and make peace with them. Not that it's going to send the Syrians back, but it will communicate to Turkish people that this is in the cards. So it will alleviate some of the social tensions facing the refugees in Turkey. And part of the reason Erdoğan is doing this, interested in this, is that to me, it looks like the UAE is really pushing for this. They're trying to get Syria to be recognized. They're inviting Assad to regional conferences. Again, they want Middle Eastern countries to make peace with Assad and recognize him and normalize ties with the Assad regime. And they have been putting this pressure on Erdoğan as well. Why is Erdoğan succumbing to this pressure? Because he needs money, because the economic crisis in Turkey is real. Along the same theme that we've been discussing, he wants to make Turkey less dependent on the West. What does that mean? He doesn't want to get out of this economic crisis with European investment, with IMF bailout. He wants to have other friends in the region, like Russia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Saudi Arabia, use them as investors in Turkey and get out of the economic crisis with cash injections from those countries. This is why he has made a U-turn just 3 years ago, Turkey was blaming the UAE from being behind the coup attempt against Erdoğan in 2016. All of the Turkish newspapers were saying the UAE is out to get us. They are supporting coup plotters against us and terrorists against us. Now they are friends. Just before the election, he made friends with the UAE and got about $5-10 billion cash injections from them. That's really, allowed Erdoğan to go on a spending spree, giving all these government handouts to his voters right before the election, which I think played a huge role in saving him. So now I think he is a little bit beholden to these regional actors like the UAE and Saudi Arabia that are rich and that can help Turkey maybe overcome this economic crisis, at least a little bit, at least feel the pain a little less. And these countries are pressuring Turkey to make peace with the Syrian regime. So I think this is very much a possibility moving forward, and we should all be on the lookout for that. It's already happening with other countries recognizing the Assad regime and normalizing relations with Syria. I think Turkey could very well do that too. Will that solve Turkey's problems in terms of the Kurdish autonomy in Syria? Will it solve Turkey's problems of having millions of Syrian refugees in Turkey? No. But there is a way Erdoğan can project a normalization with Syria to his domestic base as if it is a solution to these major problems Turkey is facing. So he could turn it into a win-win for himself. I think in terms of Syria policy, this is what we should be watching. When is Erdoğan going to normalize relations with Assad? I think it's a matter of time.
Merve Tararoğlu, great to have you with us on Shifting Ground. Thanks for joining us.
Great speaking with you, Ray. Thank you.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. Our intern is Adam Ailey. The episode was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Sport is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.